As you can see, this is about the respiratory system. There are 3 corresponding chapters in your book, but I'm going to jump around a little bit and not go from page 1 through taking that order, a little bit different order. That makes more sense to me. I'll begin with a very brief statement of the purpose of the respiratory system, which is to supply oxygen to the blood and remove carbon dioxide. We call this gas exchange. And as we get into the different problems that patients experience in the respiratory system, I think that you'll see that more often the problem starts with the elimination problem, eliminating carbon dioxide from the system. Probably the most famous of these is the COPD patient. And the COPD patient, again, has trouble eliminating carbon dioxide. And when you cannot eliminate carbon dioxide properly, it results in a deficiency of oxygen. But before we get into the specific disorders of the respiratory system, I want to do a little review of the anatomy and physiology. We'll start with the upper respiratory system, which mainly it begins with the nose, or nasal cavity as I have on here, and goes down into the throat. So nasal cavity, of course, right here. What I really want to focus on in this slide is the pharynx. The pharynx is an interesting structure because it's shared by 2 major body systems. The respiratory system, obviously, is why it's here, but it also is used by the GI system. So in the next term, when we cover med-surg of the GI, we'll see the pharynx again. I have it divided here into 3 parts, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and hypopharynx, and this is really pretty easy to understand. Nasopharynx is the part of the pharynx that's behind the nose. And again, the pharynx is our medical term for throat. So the part of the throat that's directly behind the nose we call nasopharynx. And then the part that's directly behind the mouth we call the oropharynx. And then the part of the throat that is below that we call hypopharynx, which makes sense. Hypo means below. And it's at this point that the pharynx divides either into the esophagus, which goes into the GI system, which we will not be discussing in this lecture, or it goes this way into the larynx and the trachea, which of course sends it into the respiratory system. So again, pharynx, another word for throat, it's shared by the respiratory and the GI systems. Nasopharynx, oropharynx, hypopharynx, and then if it goes respiratory, then it goes into what we call the larynx. The larynx is a fairly small portion that mainly contains the voice box. So sometimes the term the voice box and the larynx are used interchangeably. And you probably know already that when someone has laryngitis, which is inflammation of the larynx, the main sign and symptom of that is that they lose their voice. And so that makes sense as you're looking at this structure, that if we have swelling and inflammation around the voice box where the vocal cords are, that's what causes somebody to lose their voice. Whereas if we have pharyngitis, so swelling and inflammation up here, it's not going to affect the voice and cause the degree of hoarseness that we encounter with laryngitis. After it passes through this larynx or voice box part, it enters the trachea, and from trachea on downward we call that the lower respiratory system. So this is upper respiratory, anatomy of the upper respiratory. After it goes through the trachea, then we enter the lower respiratory tract. Before delving into the anatomy and physiology of the lower respiratory tract, I don't want to forget one part that's often overlooked as being part of the respiratory system, and that's the ear. If you've ever had a child that had to, or an adult that had to visit an ear, nose, and throat doctor, then maybe you're aware that there's a big connection between what goes on in the nose, the ears, and the throat. They're all connected, and here's a good diagram that shows you why. As you enter the ear here, you see this little part right here opening to the throat. And if we go back to here, you can see that this throat, which we called the pharynx here, also shares the same lining with the nasal cavities. So that's why your sinuses, which are the lining of these nasal cavities, and your ears and your throat all seem to be affected at once when somebody has like a cold, or especially in children, it seems like once they get strep throat or some type of throat infection, it just spreads everywhere. It's in their sinuses, and pretty soon they have an ear infection. And you can kind of see from this diagram why that is, that they all share that lining. So if there's bacteria present, it really has free range. It's like cattle with no fence. It can pretty much spread through the ear or the nose at will. Going back to the larynx, we're going to take a little bit more in-depth look at the larynx. If you wonder what this weird thing is, these are the vocal cords. And it takes two vocal cords really to make a sound, because they vibrate against each other or open and close like a doorway to allow air to pass through, which creates sound. We also use our nasal cavities to help create different types of sound. And human beings are capable of a huge range of sounds, and that's why our speech is one of the more developed of all animal species. Anyway, this is a graphic drawing of what the vocal cords look like, and you can see in this middle part, you can see the trachea, and these little rings, these are important. These are made of cartilage, and so this actually holds the trachea open, whereas when you get lower into the respiratory system, into the bronchioles don't have this cartilage, firm cartilage that holds them open, and so that's why some of our patients can get into what we call bronchospasm, or collapse of the bronchioles, bronchial asthma, sometimes we call it, because they don't have this structure that holds them open like the trachea does. Another important structure I wanted to point out on this picture is this little thing right here called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is kind of like a doorway that separates the respiratory system from the GI system. And so when food comes in, again, remember the pharynx is both. It's just your throat, so air goes down the pharynx and food goes down the pharynx. But when it hits this spot, the epiglottis is what determines whether it goes into the trachea down here or goes into the esophagus over here. And like I said, it's like a little doorway. So when we swallow, this doorway blocks off the trachea so that the food or water that we're swallowing goes down here. And when we're not swallowing, when we're just breathing, then it's open to allow air to pass into the trachea. So again, people can encounter problems with this structure. When it becomes inflamed, we call it epiglottitis, and that's a really scary condition that can quickly develop into respiratory distress if it's not monitored carefully. But probably more common problem would be in patients that experience something like a stroke, CVA or stroke, and they have paralysis. Maybe on one side of their face is paralyzed or drooping, and sometimes this structure right here, the epiglottis, can become either completely paralyzed or partially paralyzed so that it doesn't close off properly. And so when our patients that have had a stroke, when they swallow liquids and this doorway doesn't completely close, then they can have the problem of getting either food or liquid down into their trachea instead of it all going into the esophagus where it belongs. And we have interventions for that. We can sometimes, if it's just a problem of liquids, we can put them on the thickened liquids. And as you can imagine, if a liquid is thicker and you have just a little bit of a leak, it's going to be harder for a thick liquid to make its way through the leak than for a thin liquid. So that's why sometimes we put patients on nectar thick liquids or honey thick liquids, is because they have a problem with this epiglottis completely closing off the trachea when they swallow, and it allows fluids to leak into this. If it's completely paralyzed, where food and everything else can go down the trachea, then that's when we usually have to do a different intervention, like insert a peg tube or an alternate form of feeding that doesn't involve this structure at all. So here's a sample question I believe I pulled from your workbook. It says a patient has a weakened esophageal sphincter, and again we're probably talking about that epiglottis structure, that allows gastric contents to flow back into the throat when the patient lies down. Where does this patient experience a burning sensation? And here are your choices. And if you're thinking larynx. Actually, I would have thought maybe pharynx if it had been a choice, but the next closest is here. And if we look at our structure, let's go to here, then you can see esophagus backs up, and here's where the burning sensation would occur. So when you look at this picture, it makes that question make a little bit more sense. After we get past the trachea, we move a little bit further, what I'll call down the respiratory tract, and so we sometimes call this the lower respiratory tract. And we get into the bronchi. We have two bronchi, as you can see here, and surprisingly, they're simply labeled right and left, which makes it easy. So this is the right bronchi, and you can kind of see on this picture that the right bronchus, and that's just singular for two bronchi are bronchi, one is a bronchus. Anyway, the right bronchus is shorter and wider, and it runs a little bit straighter up and down than the left. And so I have it circled here because if somebody aspirates, say chokes on a peanut, where do you think it's going to get lodged? Most likely. Probably right here. This is where most people that have choking, this is where it happens because it's just easier for something to go down in here than to make this sharp turn and go into the left. Additionally, the right bronchus branches off before the left bronchus. And then, of course, they go into smaller and smaller, kind of like an upside down tree. You might think of it as bronchioles, and then finally ends up at what we call it terminal bronchus. Again, the bronchi or bronchioles, whatever you want to call them, are lined with smooth muscle. And as you can see here, even though this isn't a real one, but it doesn't have that cartilage that the trachea has to force it open, and so that's what makes the bronchioles more susceptible to what we call bronchospasm, where this muscle kind of spasms, or collapse, or as you can see here, gets full of nastiness and makes this opening smaller. So anytime you're listening to someone's lung sounds and you hear what we commonly call maybe a wheeze is the sound that air makes when it's passing through a constricted airway. So you can see that air passing through this might create that whistling noise, whereas air passing through this should just sound like air. I'll talk about the lungs later, but first I'm going to talk about these little guys called alveoli. And if you remember from last term, we talked about the urinary system and the kidney specifically. And I said the functional unit of the kidney is a nephron. It's this microscopic, each kidney has about 1 million of them to give you this size. And so this is really similar to the nephron of the kidney, but these are called alveoli. They're the functional unit of the lung. And again, each lung has, I don't know, very, very many of these. I don't know an exact number. And as you can see from this drawing depicting the capillary bed, this is where the actual exchange takes place. So each of these alveoli are kind of round in shape. They're really tiny and they clump together. And just like this picture says, they're kind of like a clump of grapes, and then they're surrounded by this capillary bed. And I love it when people draw capillaries rather than showing an actual picture, because they can make them the colors and show that, you know, the oxygenated capillary is red, and then the unoxygenated is blue, and the purple represents where that exchange is taking place. So that's a great drawing there. So one question you may ask is, why do they have this shape? Why are they grape-shaped instead of just nice and round? And I have an analogy that will kind of explain that, especially if you're someone who loves to go to the lake. So here's just some basic information for Oklahoma lakes. Lake Eufaula is often considered the largest lake in Oklahoma because of its surface area, 150,000 acres of water, but look at its shoreline, only 600 miles. Compare that to Grand Lake, a smaller body of water, but wow, over twice as much shoreline. Why is that? Well, let me try to do a drawing to explain. So first let's draw Lake Eufaula, really big lake. Now I'm going to draw Grand Lake. So as you can see, Lake Eufaula really has more water, but its shoreline is pretty round, whereas Grand Lake maybe has less water, but because it's shaped kind of like this flower,